It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in Silver Creek, the kind of day where life hummed quietly along the small town's unassuming rhythm. James Warren, a 47-year-old locksmith and father of two, was busy working on a stubborn safe at Marlin's pawn shop. For James, solving puzzles like cracked locks and rusty bolts was more than just his job, it was his passion. But he never expected this ordinary day to catapult him into a whirlwind of history, danger, and moral dilemmas. The call came just after noon. Sheriff Beckett, a gruff man who rarely dealt with James unless absolutely necessary, was on the other end. His tone was urgent, almost impatient. "James, we've got an old safe here at the station that needs opening. It's part of some evidence from a raid last week. Can you come over?" There was no room for negotiation, though James briefly considered declining. He had a backlog of work, and the sheriff's vague urgency unsettled him. But the promise of solving another mystery, and the chance to break the monotony of his day, was too tempting to resist. When James arrived at the sheriff's office, he was greeted by a peculiar scene. The safe, heavily rusted and coated in years of grime, sat on a table, surrounded by curious deputies. It looked ancient, its metal corroded and scarred by time. Beckett waved James over with an impatient gesture. "This was found during a raid on an old warehouse up by Route 9. Place was abandoned for decades, but rumor has it, this safe belonged to someone important. No markings, no serial numbers, just this." Beckett pointed to a small, barely legible engraving on the front of the safe, Dale Enterprises. The name rang a faint bell in James' mind, though he couldn't quite place it. He ran his fingers over the surface, feeling the weight of history in the cold, rough metal. There was something almost reverent about the way the safe sat there, like it was guarding something precious. "What's inside?" James asked, his curiosity piqued. Beckett shrugged. "That's what you're here to figure out. Just get it open, Warren." James set to work, unpacking his tools and inspecting the locking mechanism. It was old, very old. The kind of craftsmanship you didn't see anymore. This wasn't just a safe, it was a fortress, designed to keep its secrets hidden from anyone who dared to pry. As James worked, a few deputies hovered nearby, muttering theories about what might be inside. "Gold bars," one joked. "Or maybe some old gangster's loot." Another suggested it was empty, just an overhyped relic. But James couldn't shake the feeling that this safe held something far more significant. An hour passed as James meticulously worked on the lock. He was close, he could feel it. The tumblers clicked into place one by one, each sound echoing like a small victory in the quiet room. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he turned the final dial. "Almost there," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And then, it happened. The lock gave way with a loud clunk, but before James could even reach for the handle, a burst of bright red paint sprayed out from the edges of the safe, coating him and everyone within a few feet. There was a collective gasp as the deputies jumped back, startled by the unexpected explosion of color. James stood frozen, his hands dripping with paint, as he processed what had just happened. "What the hell?" Beckett barked, wiping paint off his face. The room was chaos, shouting, confusion, and the acrid smell of paint filling the air. But James' attention was fixed on the safe. Through the mess of paint, he could see something inside, a stack of documents wrapped in protective plastic, untouched by the spray. He carefully reached in, his fingers trembling, and pulled them out. The room fell silent as James unfolded the first document. It was yellowed with age, but well preserved, its elegant handwriting still legible. At the top of the page, stamped in bold letters, were the words, "Confidential, property of General Marcus Dale." James' heart skipped a beat. He now remembered where he had heard that name. General Marcus Dale was a revered figure in military history, a black leader who had commanded covert operations during World War II. His life was a mix of triumph and tragedy, and his contributions to the war effort were often overshadowed by the systemic racism of his time. "What is this?" one of the deputies asked, leaning in to get a closer look. James didn't answer. He was too engrossed in the papers, which seemed to contain handwritten notes, maps, and what appeared to be a sealed letter addressed to the Pentagon. The weight of what he was holding began to sink in. This wasn't just a safe. It was a time capsule, a piece of history that had been buried and forgotten. Beckett, however, was less impressed. "Bag it up," he ordered, motioning for a deputy to take the documents. "This is evidence now." But James hesitated. "Sheriff," he said slowly, "do you realize what this is? These documents, they belong to General Dale's legacy. They could be important." Beckett gave him a hard look. "That's not your call to make, Warren. Now step back." Reluctantly, James handed over the documents, but a nagging feeling told him this was far from over. As he cleaned the paint from his tools and prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the sense that he had just opened Pandora's box. The safe had revealed its secrets, but it had also raised more questions than answers. What was General Dale's connection to this small town? Why had his belongings ended up in an abandoned warehouse? And who, if anyone, had been trying to keep them hidden? As James walked out of the sheriff's office, his clothes still speckled with red paint, he couldn't help but feel that his life had just taken an unexpected turn. Little did he know, the safe secrets were only the beginning, and the choices he would have to make in the days to come would change not only his life, but the entire town of Silver Creek. The story of the safe and its mysterious contents spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. By the next morning, nearly everyone in town had heard about the strange events at the sheriff's office. People whispered about the paint-spraying trap, speculated wildly about the documents, and debated why something belonging to a historic military figure like General Marcus Dale would end up in a decrepit warehouse miles from anywhere significant. For James Warren, the locksmith who had opened the safe, the attention was both thrilling and overwhelming. He hadn't slept much, haunted by the feeling that he had stumbled into something far bigger than himself. The general's name carried weight, even in Silver Creek, a place far removed from the battlegrounds of history. General Marcus Dale had been a decorated military officer, known for his brilliance as a strategist during World War II. But his legacy had always been complicated. As one of the few black generals of his time, Dale had faced relentless discrimination, even from his own country. Despite his achievements, much of his story had been obscured, his contributions overshadowed by systemic prejudice. To many in the black community, he was a symbol of resilience, someone who had fought not only against enemies abroad but also against injustice at home. James couldn't stop thinking about the documents he'd seen before Sheriff Beckett had taken them. The sealed letter addressed to the Pentagon gnawed at his curiosity, as did the maps and notes. What secrets did they hold? Were they part of some forgotten military operation? Or was it something more personal, an attempt by Dale to preserve his story in a world that seemed eager to erase it? These questions swirled in James's mind as he sat at his kitchen table that morning, staring at his coffee cup, now stone cold. He felt a strange connection to General Dale, a man he had never met. Perhaps it was the sense of injustice, the idea that someone's legacy could be locked away, hidden, and forgotten. James's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at his door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see a woman standing there, dressed in a faded trench coat and clutching a notebook. She looked to be in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mr. Warren?" she asked. "I'm Claire Morgan, a journalist with the Silver Creek Sentinel. I was hoping to speak with you about the safe." James hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to get involved in any kind of publicity, but something about Claire's demeanor, her quiet intensity, made him step aside and let her in. Over coffee, she peppered him with questions about the safe, the documents, and the bizarre paint trap. James answered cautiously, careful not to reveal too much. But when Claire brought up General Dale, something shifted in their conversation. "Do you know much about him?" James asked. Claire nodded. "A fair bit. I've written about him before, mostly about his time in the military. He was an incredible man, but his story's been lost to history in a lot of ways. That's why this safe is so important. It could be the missing piece to understanding who he really was." Her words resonated with James. He told her about the sealed letter and the maps he'd seen, though he left out some details, unsure if he could fully trust her. Claire listened intently, scribbling notes in her notebook. "You realize this isn't just about history," she said. "If those documents are what I think they are, they could change everything. They could prove that Dale was involved in operations that were never acknowledged by the government, operations that could explain why someone wanted this safe hidden for so long." James frowned. "What do you mean? Hidden by who?" Claire leaned forward. "That's the question, isn't it? Why would someone go to the trouble of rigging the safe with a paint trap? It wasn't just to deter thieves. It was to destroy evidence if anyone got too close. Whoever set that trap didn't want the contents of that safe to see the light of day." The weight of her words settled over James like a heavy fog. He thought about the warehouse where the safe had been found. It was an old, decrepit building on the outskirts of town, long abandoned and largely forgotten. But now, in light of what Claire was saying, it seemed less like a random storage site and more like a deliberate hiding place. The safe hadn't just been lost, it had been buried, hidden away where no one would think to look. Later that day, unable to resist the pull of his curiosity, James drove out to the warehouse. The structure loomed on the horizon, a skeletal reminder of Silver Creek's industrial past. As he stepped inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, casting jagged shadows on the floor. James walked cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The area where the safe had been found was marked with police tape, but James noticed something odd. The floor around the spot was disturbed, as if someone had been digging or searching for something. Kneeling down, he examined the ground more closely and saw faint marks, scratches and indentations that suggested there had been other safes or containers there. Had the safe he opened been just one piece of a larger puzzle? And if so, what had happened to the rest? His thoughts were interrupted by a noise behind him, a faint creak, like the sound of a footstep. James froze, his heart pounding. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, but he could feel someone watching him. Slowly, he turned, his eyes scanning the shadows. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a figure slipping out of sight. But when he rushed to the spot, there was no one there. The warehouse was empty. Shaken, James hurried back to his truck and drove home, his mind racing. The feeling of being watched stayed with him, a gnawing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the idea that someone didn't want him asking questions about the safe. But who? And why? That night, as he lay in bed, James thought about General Dale and the legacy he had left behind. He thought about the documents, the maps, and the letter addressed to the Pentagon. And he thought about the paint trap, a bizarre and almost theatrical warning. There was a story here, a truth that someone had tried to bury. And James, whether he liked it or not, had become a part of that story. As sleep finally overtook him, James made a quiet vow to himself: he would find out the truth, no matter the cost. What he didn't know was that the cost would be far higher than he could have ever imagined. The following morning, James woke up with a restless energy. The events of the past 2 days had been circling in his mind like a storm, and every time he tried to push them aside, another detail clawed its way to the surface. He couldn't ignore the feeling that the discovery of the safe was just the beginning. Someone out there knew more about its significance, and that someone likely didn't want him or anyone else digging deeper. Determined to make sense of things, James decided to take the day off from his locksmith duties. He needed answers, and the first place to start was the documents themselves. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about the maps and that sealed letter to the Pentagon. Why would a general, a man known for his meticulous nature, seal a letter and leave it in a safe with such elaborate protection? He suspected that whatever was inside held the key to the entire mystery. James called Claire Morgan, the journalist he'd met the previous day. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and businesslike. "Mr. Warren, I was just about to call you," she said. "There's something you need to see." "What is it?" James asked, gripping the phone tighter. "Meet me at the library in an hour," Claire replied. I've been doing some digging, and I found something that might explain why General Dale's name keeps coming up in all of this. By the time James arrived at the library, Claire was waiting for him with a stack of old newspaper clippings and military records spread across a table. She had a determined glint in her eye as she gestured for him to sit. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an article from the 1950s. The headline read, "General Dale's Secret Files, a Threat to National Security?" Beneath it was a grainy black and white photo of General Marcus Dale, standing in front of a group of soldiers. "This article came out during the height of the Cold War," Claire explained. "It claims that General Dale had evidence of covert operations that weren't sanctioned by the government. Operations that involved missions in Europe and Africa, targeting assets that weren't officially considered wartime enemies." James leaned forward, scanning the article. "So, what does this have to do with the safe?" "Everything," Claire said. "If the documents in that safe are related to those operations, they could contain information the government, or someone else, doesn't want made public. Think about it, Dale's career ended abruptly after this article came out. He was essentially blacklisted, his contributions to the war effort overshadowed by controversy. And then, a few years later, his personal belongings, including this safe, just disappeared." James felt a chill run down his spine. "But why hide it in a warehouse in Silver Creek? Why here?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Claire admitted. "But there's more. Look at this." She handed James a photocopy of a map. It was old and faded, but the markings were clear, a series of coordinates stretching across several states, with one point circled in bold red ink. This map was part of General Dale's personal effects. "It matches one of the documents you described seeing in the safe." "The circled point? That's Silver Creek." James stared at the map, his mind racing. "So, you're saying he intentionally left something here? But why?" Claire shrugged. "Maybe he trusted someone in this town. Maybe he thought it was the last place anyone would look. Whatever the reason, it's clear he wanted this safe, and whatever it contained, protected." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. It was Claire's cell. She answered it quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as she listened. "What? Are you sure?" she said into the phone, her voice rising. "All right, we'll be there as soon as we can." "What's wrong?" James asked as she hung up. "That was one of my contacts at the sheriff's office," Claire said. "The safe isn't at the station anymore. It's been taken." James felt his stomach drop. "Taken by who?" "Officially, they're saying federal agents," Claire replied. "But my contact says no one's seen any credentials. They just showed up last night, loaded the safe into an unmarked van, and left. No paperwork, no explanations." The implications were clear. Whoever these people were, they weren't interested in following protocol. James clenched his fists, anger bubbling to the surface. "We can't let this go," he said. "If they've taken this safe, it means there's something in there they don't want anyone else to see." Claire nodded. "Agreed. But we'll need more than speculation if we're going to figure this out. We need to find out who's behind this and what they're hiding." Over the next few hours, James and Claire dove deeper into their research. They scoured public records, interviewed local residents, and even visited the site of the warehouse again. The more they uncovered, the more suspicious the entire situation became. One discovery, in particular, stood out. An elderly man named Harold Simmons, a retired postal worker who had lived in Silver Creek for decades, revealed that he had once delivered packages to General Dale during the late 1940s. According to Harold, the general had owned a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a place he used as a retreat after his military service. He was a quiet man, Harold recalled, his voice trembling with age. Kept to himself mostly, but there was something about him. You could tell he carried a heavy burden. He used to get these letters, official-looking ones, like from the government. But one day, they just stopped coming, and he disappeared not long after that. The mention of the cabin sent a spark of hope through James. If General Dale had lived there, maybe there was something left behind, something that could shed light on the mystery of the safe. He and Claire decided to investigate the cabin that same evening. The drive out to the cabin was tense, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around them as darkness fell. When they finally arrived, the structure was barely standing, its roof sagging and its walls covered in moss. But as James stepped inside, flashlight in hand, he felt a strange sense of purpose. This place, like the safe, held secrets waiting to be uncovered. As they searched the cabin, James and Claire found little of value: old furniture, rotting floorboards, and broken windows. But in the corner of what had once been the living room, James noticed a loose floorboard. With some effort, he pried it up, revealing a small metal box hidden beneath. Inside the box were more documents, along with a faded photograph of General Dale standing beside a young soldier. The soldier was smiling, his arm draped over the general's shoulders, but there was something haunting in Dale's expression, a mixture of pride and sadness. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten note. "For the one who finds this, trust is a rare gift. Guard it well." James and Claire exchanged a look, both understanding the weight of what they had just found. The safe may have been taken, but the story was far from over. This was only the discovery of the hidden box in General Dale's abandoned cabin left James and Claire with more questions than answers. Sitting in the dim light of the cabin, the photograph and the note weighed heavily on their minds. The young soldier in the picture was unfamiliar to both of them, but his presence alongside the general hinted at a deeper connection. The cryptic message, "Trust is a rare gift. Guard it well," echoed in James's mind like a warning. What had Dale been trying to say? Was this a clue meant for someone specific, or was it a general plea to protect his secrets? They carefully packed the contents of the box and returned to James's house, where they could examine everything in safety. As they spread the materials out on his dining room table, Claire noticed something unusual about the photograph. "Look at the general's uniform," she said, pointing to a small insignia barely visible on the shoulder. "That's not standard issue. It's something else." James leaned in for a closer look, but it was Claire who made the connection first. She pulled out her laptop and began frantically searching through archived military insignias. "This symbol," she said, tapping the screen, "it's linked to a covert task force that operated during World War II. Officially, it doesn't exist. But there are whispers, rumors of a unit tasked with missions that were too dangerous or politically sensitive for the regular military." James frowned. "You're saying General Dale was part of this task force?" "Not just a part of it," Claire said, her voice filled with awe. "He might have been leading it. If that's true, it explains why his career was so controversial and why he was silenced. A black man in such a powerful position during that era? It would have made him enemies, even among his own allies." The implications were staggering. General Dale wasn't just a brilliant strategist, he was a man operating at the highest levels of secrecy, navigating a treacherous political landscape. And now, decades later, the contents of his safe were causing ripples powerful enough to bring unmarked vans and shadowy agents to Silver Creek. But James and Claire weren't the only ones piecing the puzzle together. As they worked late into the night, trying to make sense of their discoveries, a pair of headlights flashed outside James's window. He froze, his heart pounding. "Claire, did you tell anyone we were coming back here?" "No," she whispered, quickly closing her laptop. "Why?" James motioned for her to stay quiet as he peered through the blinds. A dark SUV was idling across the street, its engine running, but its lights off. The vehicle was unmarked, but something about it screamed government, or worse. "We're being watched," James said, his voice low. "Whoever took the safe is onto us." Claire grabbed her phone and began snapping pictures of the SUV, but before she could take more than a couple, the vehicle sped off into the night. The sudden silence it left behind was even more unnerving. "We need to get out of here," Claire said, her voice trembling. "If they're watching us, it's only a matter of time before they come back. And next time, they might not just watch." James nodded, quickly gathering the materials from the cabin. Together, they drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, where they could regroup and figure out their next steps. As they sat in the cramped room, the weight of the situation began to sink in. "We're dealing with people who will go to any lengths to keep this buried," Claire said. "But why? What's in those documents that's so dangerous?" James thought about the maps he'd seen in the safe and the photograph of the young soldier. A chilling thought occurred to him. "What if it's not just about history?" he said. "What if there's something in those documents that's still relevant today, something that could expose people who are still in power?" Claire looked at him, her eyes wide with realization. "That would explain why they're so desperate to retrieve everything. It's not just about protecting General Dale's legacy, it's about protecting themselves." The following day, James and Claire decided to take a calculated risk. They contacted a retired historian named Dr. Evelyn Carter, an expert on World War II covert operations. Dr. Carter was well respected in academic circles, known for her integrity and her willingness to delve into controversial topics. If anyone could help them decode the materials, it was her. When they arrived at Dr. Carter's house, she greeted them warmly but with a wary look. "I've heard whispers about your discovery," she said as they sat down in her cluttered study. "You're playing a dangerous game, digging into this." James and Claire laid out everything they had found, from the photograph and note to the box's other contents. Dr. Carter examined each piece carefully, her expression growing more serious with every passing moment. "This photograph," she said, holding it up, "is more significant than you realize." "The young soldier beside General Dale? That's Lieutenant Samuel Green. He disappeared during the war under mysterious circumstances. Officially, he was declared Kia, but there have always been rumors that he was involved in something classified. If he was working with Dale, it could explain a lot." "What about the maps?" Claire asked. Dr. Carter unfolded the map they had retrieved and studied it intently. "These coordinates mark locations that were key during the war," she said. "But there's something else. Look at the pattern they form." James and Claire leaned in, their eyes tracing the lines connecting the coordinates. They formed a symbol, one that was eerily similar to the insignia on Dale's uniform. "It's a code," Dr. Carter said. "A message. And if I'm right, it points to another location, one that might hold the answers you're looking for." The location, as it turned out, wasn't far from Silver Creek. It was an abandoned military bunker hidden deep in the woods, a place that had been decommissioned decades ago. But as Dr. Carter warned, it was likely still under surveillance. "You're not just up against time," she said. "You're up against people who will stop at nothing to keep this secret." James and Claire exchanged a determined look. They knew the risks, but they also knew they couldn't turn back now. General Dale's legacy, and the truth he had fought to protect, depended on them. As they prepared for their journey to the bunker, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into a web of danger far more complex than they had anticipated. Every step they took brought them closer to the heart of the mystery, and closer to the unseen forces determined to stop them. James and Claire stood at the edge of the dense forest, their breath visible in the cool morning air. The coordinates they decoded with Dr. Carter's help led them here, to a forgotten piece of land on the outskirts of Silver Creek. The overgrown path before them twisted into the woods, where the abandoned military bunker was said to be hidden. Armed with flashlights, a hastily packed bag of supplies, and an unshakable determination, they ventured forward, leaving the relative safety of their car behind. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. The further they walked, the thicker the underbrush became, as if nature itself were conspiring to keep the bunker concealed. After nearly an hour of trudging through the woods, Claire spotted something unusual ahead. A section of ground covered in a grid of rusted metal panels. They approached cautiously, brushing away leaves and debris to reveal what appeared to be a hatch, partially obscured by decades of dirt and moss. "This has to be it," Claire whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. James knelt down, inspecting the hatch. It was locked with a corroded padlock, but to a skilled locksmith like him, it posed little challenge. Within minutes, he had it open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. The air wafting up was stale and metallic, carrying the faint scent of decay. "Are we really doing this?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We've come too far to turn back now," James replied, gripping the rungs of the ladder and starting his descent. The bunker was surprisingly intact, despite its age. Concrete walls lined with rusted pipes gave way to a series of dimly lit corridors. The faint glow of emergency lights flickered sporadically, suggesting that some backup power source was still operational. As they moved deeper into the facility, they passed abandoned equipment, faded maps pinned to walls, and stacks of dusty crates labeled with cryptic military codes. "This place is a time capsule," Claire said, her voice hushed. "It's like they just left." James stopped suddenly, holding up his flashlight. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, with the words "Restricted Access, Level Alpha Clearance Required" stenciled on its surface. "This is it," he said, pushing the door open. Inside, they found a small room filled with filing cabinets, shelves of old documents, and a single metal desk. But what immediately drew their attention was the large map pinned to the wall. Unlike the one they'd found in the safe, this map was marked with far more detail. Locations across the United States, Europe, and Africa were connected by a web of red lines. At the center of it all was Silver Creek, circled in bold black ink. Claire moved closer, her eyes scanning the map. "This isn't just a record of past missions," she said. "It's a blueprint, something ongoing. Look at the dates." James leaned in, noticing what she meant. Many of the locations were accompanied by dates stretching into the present day. This wasn't just about history, it was a living operation, still active decades after General Dale's death. As they sifted through the documents, a clearer picture began to emerge. The task force Dale had led during World War II wasn't disbanded after the war. Instead, it had evolved into a secretive organization operating in the shadows, executing missions too sensitive, or too illegal, for public knowledge. The documents detailed covert operations, political assassinations, and the manipulation of foreign governments. "This is explosive," Claire said, holding up a file marked with the seal of the Department of Defense. "If this gets out, it could bring down entire administrations." James nodded, but his mind was racing. Why had General Dale hidden these materials? Why had he chosen Silver Creek as the epicenter of his legacy? And, more importantly, who was still carrying out these missions under the radar? Their search was interrupted by a distant noise, a metallic clang that echoed through the bunker. Claire froze, her eyes wide with fear. "We're not alone," she whispered. James grabbed a nearby wrench, the only weapon within reach, and motioned for Claire to stay behind him. They crept back into the hallway, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of a radio. "Whoever it is, they're armed," James muttered. Before they could retreat further, a voice barked, "Stop where you are." Two men in tactical gear emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by masks. They carried rifles, their movements precise and practiced. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said, his voice cold and authoritative. "Drop whatever you've taken and leave." James's heart raced, but he stood his ground. "We're not leaving without answers," he said. "This place, these files, they belong to the people. Not to you." The man chuckled darkly. "You have no idea what you're meddling with. General Dale's legacy is bigger than you can imagine. Walk away now, and maybe we'll forget we found you." Claire stepped forward, surprising both James and the intruders. "If you're so concerned about protecting this legacy, why hide in the shadows?" she demanded. "Why not tell the world the truth?" Her defiance seemed to rattle them, but only for a moment. One of the men raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at James. "Last warning," he said. Before anyone could react, a sudden burst of static came from the radio clipped to the man's vest. "Unit 2, we've got company topside. Multiple vehicles approaching." The intruders exchanged a glance before one of them spoke into his radio. Understood. Secure the files and move out. They turned their attention back to James and Claire. You got lucky, one of them said. But this isn't over. Stay out of our way, or you won't get another warning. With that, the men retreated, disappearing into the depths of the bunker. James and Claire wasted no time grabbing as many documents as they could carry before making their escape. As they emerged from the hatch, they saw headlights cutting through the trees. A convoy of unmarked vehicles was pulling up, their occupants clearly not local law enforcement. James and Claire sprinted into the woods, hearts pounding, knowing they had narrowly avoided capture. When they finally reached their car, Claire turned to James, her face pale but determined. This isn't just about General Dale anymore, she said. This is bigger than anything we imagined. We can't stop now. James nodded. They had uncovered a conspiracy that stretched across decades, one that threatened to rewrite history. But as they drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The truth was out there, waiting to be revealed, but at what cost? James and Claire drove through the winding backroads of Silver Creek, their hands gripping the wheel and their nerves on edge. The weight of the files they'd retrieved pressed heavily on them, both physically and emotionally. The stack of papers sat in the back seat, their edges illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight as they passed through the outskirts of town. They were silent, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what had just happened in the bunker and what their next move should be. Claire broke the silence. We can't just sit on this, James. People deserve to know the truth. This operation, it's not just some relic of the past. It's alive, and it's dangerous. If we don't expose it, no one will. James's eyes stayed on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. You're right, he said finally. But we need to be smart about this. Whoever's running this operation, they're watching us. They've got resources, connections, power. If we make a wrong move, we might not get another chance. They pulled into the parking lot of an old diner on the edge of town, a place they knew would be deserted at this hour. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and fried food greeted them, along with the flickering hum of a neon sign. James grabbed the files from the car and followed Claire to a booth in the back corner, where they spread the documents out across the table. Claire flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning for something concrete they could use. These are mission reports, she said, pointing to a file marked Operation Iron Hand. They're coded, but look at the signatures at the bottom. These aren't just field agents, they're high-ranking officials. Some of these names are still in positions of power today. James leaned over, studying the pages. His locksmith's eye, trained to notice the smallest details, caught something Claire had missed. Look here, he said, pointing to the margins of one of the documents. These marks, they're coordinates. Claire pulled out her phone and plugged in the numbers. Her face paled as the map loaded. James, this isn't just a random location. It's a secure government facility. And it's active. The realization hit them both like a freight train. The task force that General Dale had once led wasn't just lingering in the shadows, it was operating out in the open, hiding in plain sight. Whatever they were doing now, it wasn't just about history. As they worked, the diner's door creaked open, and an older man in a weathered coat stepped inside. He glanced around the empty space before making his way toward their booth. James tensed, his hand instinctively moving to the wrench he'd tucked into his bag. I'm not here to hurt you, the man said, his voice low and steady. But you two are in way over your heads. Who are you? Claire demanded, her eyes narrowing. The man slid into the booth across from them. Name's Thomas, he said. I used to work with Dale. Back when this whole mess started. James and Claire exchanged a glance. You're saying you were part of his unit? James asked. Thomas nodded, his expression grim. Not just part of it. I was his right-hand man. We were tasked with missions the government didn't want on the record. Things that were necessary, or so we thought at the time. But Dale, he started to see the cracks. He realized we weren't just fighting wars, we were being used. And when he tried to shut it down, they turned on him. Claire leaned forward, her voice urgent. Why now? Why come to us? Thomas sighed, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. Because you found what they've been trying to hide all these years. Dale wasn't just protecting his legacy, he was protecting the truth. And now that you've uncovered it, they'll stop at nothing to silence you. He slid the journal across the table. This was Dale's. He gave it to me the night before he disappeared, told me to keep it safe. I didn't understand why until now. James opened the journal, his eyes scanning the pages. Inside were detailed notes, sketches, and what appeared to be a list of names. Many of the names were crossed out, but a few remained, along with cryptic notations. These names, James said, pointing to the list. Who are they? People Dale trusted, Thomas said. Or at least, people he thought he could trust. Some of them might still be out there, willing to help. But others, well, let's just say they've chosen the wrong side. Claire's phone buzzed, breaking the tense moment. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. James, she said, her voice shaking. They've found us. Outside, the faint glow of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. James grabbed the journal and the files, shoving them into his bag. We need to move. Now. Thomas stood, his expression grim. There's a safe house, not far from here. I'll take you there. But you need to understand, once you go down this path, there's no turning back. They didn't have time to debate. Following Thomas, they slipped out the back of the diner just as the vehicles pulled into the parking lot. The sound of boots hitting pavement echoed behind them, and James felt a surge of adrenaline as they sprinted into the darkness. The safe house was a small, nondescript cabin hidden deep in the woods. Inside, Thomas secured the doors and windows before turning to James and Claire. This is where it gets real, he said. You've got the truth. Now you need to decide what to do with it. Claire looked at James, her eyes filled with determination. We expose them, she said. We let the world know what they've done, what they're still doing. James nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The files, the journal, the bunker, it all pointed to a conspiracy so vast that taking it on felt like an impossible task. But as he looked at Claire and Thomas, he knew they couldn't walk away. They spent the night planning their next move, knowing that the forces arrayed against them would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's windows, James felt a flicker of hope. They had the truth. And for the first time, they had a chance to fight back.